the foreign policy of the Netanyahu, of the Bennett-Lapid government, but also former Netanyahu governments in terms of characteristics, policy, conduct and style, and key actors? What's been changing, and maybe what is continuing as was?
Hi. First, thank you for inviting me to speak at this panel. What's been changing, other than everything, I think that what we're seeing now has no connection to anything Israeli foreign policy knew before. Not because anybody was sitting in a room having a discussion and saying, "Oh, let's change our policy on the Palestinian issue or the Iranian issue or any other issue." But the fact is that this government in its first 3 months is totally dysfunctional and chaotic. And almost any step it does not come out of initiative, but out of reaction to events. This is also a government that for the first time in history, it's the most far-right government in Israel's history, with racist and Jewish supremacist elements in it, in key positions that have a lot of influence on foreign relations and national security, like Itamar Ben-Gvir as the Minister of National Security, or Mr. Smotrich as Minister of Finance. And I think that when Netanyahu came in, he said several things. First, he said that he's going to be with his hands on the wheel, on the wheel when it comes to national security and foreign policy. I think that 3 months after this government was formed, it's obvious to everybody that this is not the case. He is not running anything. Everything is chaotic. And second, he put forward a pretty ambitious foreign policy agenda. First, stressing that he will, focus on Iran, obviously, and on countering its nuclear program. And second, he said that he will try to broaden the Abraham Accords and get a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. In the last 3 months, he done nothing. Not on the first foreign policy goal, not on his second foreign policy goal. And this is because everything in Israel is consumed by this judicial overhaul, which basically hijacked the government's agenda and created a situation where Israel gets tons of international criticism while not promoting any of the government's foreign policy stated goals. So I think that the combination between far-right ministers who every other day say something or do something that creates outrage around the world, the fact that Netanyahu is not in control, and the fact that the agenda is hijacked by the judicial overhaul, the combination of all of those three factors created a sharp decline in Israel's international standing.
Dr. Shai, one of the key relationships that Israel has is with the US. Just today, you published an op-ed that is spelling out the crisis that is emerging in Israeli-American relationship in terms of the criticism, the mounting criticism by Biden and his administration on things that Netanyahu has been doing, but also the responses coming out of the Israeli coalition that are basically attacking the US in a way that we didn't see before. So how deep is the current crisis in Israeli-American relationship? And broadly speaking, what can the American president do to help safeguard Israeli democracy? We saw he invited Netanyahu to speak at the Summit for Democracy this week. Is that what you would expect him to do, or are there other things that he can more effectively carry out? And you're muted, Nachman.
Sorry. What I said is first, thank you very much, Nimrod. And secondly, I would follow Barak's assessment by saying that, requoting what Henry Kissinger said at the time that Israel actually doesn't have a foreign policy, only domestic policy, and it has been reflected by its what's called foreign policy. And after almost 100 days in office, I can hardly see what this government intends to do in terms of foreign policy. I'm just looking for the foreign policy. But on the other hand, there's no lack of foreign ministers in this government. There are at least 4 appointees, the prime minister himself, and 3, if not more, of his appointees, 2 government ministers and the national security advisor. All of them are involved in foreign policy. So we have a lack of foreign policy, but we have too many guys dealing with foreign policy, which doesn't, of course, help. I'm not speaking about all the other ministers and Knesset members that know very little about foreign policy in general, and specifically about Israel-US relationship, but very open and publicly attack and criticize other states, and including the United States, which absolutely doesn't help Israel's foreign policy. Now, to your question, what can the President Biden do at this stage? He made very clear yesterday that he's very, I would say, emotionally, he's very angry at Netanyahu and Israel, because he sent us few messages. 2 of his senior secretaries, the Secretary of Defense and the State Secretary, visited Israel, the National Security Advisor, and the ambassador, the serving ambassador in Israel as well. Everyone has been saying almost the same message: wait and see, look for a compromise, don't rush. Nothing is burning. You have plenty of time, and especially don't change the character of Israel's democracy. And it's obvious that the government ignored all those early warnings. So finally, it came out of him. It was not not press conference. It was not a written statement. It came just from his heart, which is the best way to interpret it. That's what Biden thinks of Netanyahu and the state of Israel and the current coalition at this stage. And especially, he doesn't want to see Netanyahu. He knows Netanyahu is looking very hard to come to Washington and to play the card like the best of his. Netanyahu is its best when it comes to Washington. That's almost his hometown. And he doesn't want to give him the pleasure to take advantage of the White House or Washington. And that's a kind of, I would say, kind of punishment. Wait, stay home and do your job first before you come to Washington. And the United States, it's rare. It doesn't happen usually that the United States is so clear, open, and transparent in its policy towards Israel. And I'm very much concerned about that, because I remember times in the past that United States took some time off and had what we call reassessment in its relationship with Israel at least twice or 3 times. I remember from my own experience, it doesn't work for the benefit of Israel. So I believe the government of Israel should take it very seriously into consideration. And yes, we don't have to wait for the American reassessment. We have to, here at Israel, reassess our own policy and figure out how many mistakes were already done by the government and how the government is going to correct them before they turn to the United States and says, please invite Prime Minister Netanyahu to Washington.
Thank you, Professor Podeh. You've been doing a lot of research on Israel's relation with the Arab world, including on the secret ties that are happening beneath the radar over the years. Barak mentioned how Netanyahu is seeking to normalize relations with the Saudis, but the Saudis don't seem to be playing along at the moment. What is currently happening between Israel and Saudi Arabia, also given the context of the secret relations that have been taking place over the years, and if Israel now or later would like to normalize ties with the Saudis, what should it do, especially relating to the Palestinian issue?
Okay, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Nimrod, in response to your question, first of all, in general, I would say, this is not a history class, but along the year between Saudi Arabia and Israel, there were secret ties along the years. I mean, this is quite surprising. I think that most of the people, they are unaware how significant they were. And on certain times, like we say today, that there are common enemies. For example, Iran, I mean, in the past, it was Iraq under Saddam Hussein and Yemen. Anyway, so that was in the past. No doubt this government, one of the major aims of Netanyahu was to broaden the Abraham Accord. And we also that his main target was to try and to persuade Saudi Arabia to join the club. He hasn't succeeded, and that is not necessarily connected with what is going on, with the judicial reform. It's something bigger, and it even started earlier. In fact, what the Saudis are doing, they're having something that I call, they're adopting an insurance policy. That means that on certain occasions, they need to play with both sides because they're unsure about how sincere, how committed is one side in order to solve the problem. In that case, is the Iranian Shiite threat to the Saudis. And therefore, for the last 2 years, they have been holding negotiations with the Iranians, being held in Oman or in Baghdad, in Iraq. And the target was somehow to ameliorate the tension between the two countries. So that went for a long time. And in many ways, they are imitating the Emiratis, because the Emiratis, they resumed the relations with Iran a year ago. Also, the Emiratis resumed relations with Syria. And now Saudi Arabia is following the same line. So that, of course, has some significance to Israeli-Saudi relations. It's not on the expense necessarily. It means that I think that the Saudis will keep and maintain secret relations with Israel, but at the same time, they will have good relations with the Iranians. By the way, similar again to United Arab Emirates, who, it's unbelievable, the amount of trade between the Emirates and Iran. It's 15 billion annually, dollars, 15, which is amazing sum of money. And more or less the same sum can be maybe predicted with relations to Saudi-Iranian relations. So therefore, the Saudis, they have bigger interest in the area, which are connected with trade, connected with security. And therefore, this is how it's seen from Riyadh. Now, what can be done in order to strengthen relations between Israel and the Saudis? First of all, it is now a problem if the report in the Wall Street Journal is correct, because the Saudis, they were trying to get from the Americans, first of all, some security guarantees, and secondly, the consent to a capability of nuclear energy for peace times. But this is something that the United States is very much against, and Israel, of course. Israel has always objected to any of the Arab countries having nuclear energy, even if it's for peaceful aims. So if in that connection, Israel and the United States cannot help or support the Saudi claim, then you have here a major problem in normalizing relations. Secondly, it's of course the Palestinian issue. Now, it has been said that this is not a major or the major issue for the Saudis, and they hinted at that direction. But I believe that any tension, and certainly an intifada or something significant that happens between Israel and the Palestinians, especially if Jerusalem is involved, is going to hamper, is going to hurt any developments between the Israeli and the Saudis. So it's not on the horizon, or anyway, in the immediate horizon.
Thank you. Moving from the Middle East to Europe, Dr. Sion Sidkiyahu, those following regional foreign policy are quite surprised to see the EU taking a low-profile reaction to what's happening in Israel. We're using the past to see a lot of condemnations or statements by European officials on things that Israel was doing, but now when democratic erosion is happening in Israel and democracy is a key value for the European Union, Joseph Borrell is relatively silent on the issue, also saying, well, this is something that Israelis should deal with on their own. And that is at the same time that the government is once again going into EU bashing that characterized previous Netanyahu government. So how do you explain this European reaction to what's happening in Israel, and which broader ties or trends you see in Europe-Israel relations?
Thank you, Nimrod. So indeed, I share your evaluation of sort of a puzzle. Why is Brussels keeping silent? We have heard a small sentence by Roberta Metsola, the president of the European Parliament, when Herzog was visiting Brussels on Holocaust International Day. But the rest of the leaders of the EU institutions have kept silent. And this is quite indeed awkward. But if we remember that most of the criticism coming from the EU institutions toward Israel was actually connected to the Middle East peace process, the lack of the Middle East peace process with the Palestinians and our actions vis-a-vis the Palestinians, then perhaps, we can explain the silence because it is a domestic issue, because they have been given very clear, not even warnings, but clear messages from the foreign minister himself, from Eli Cohen to Borrell directly in a phone conversation: do not interfere in our internal issues. This is something that Israel is now saying also to the United States, but to Europe, it has been saying that for a long time. And now it is a domestic issue. So in a sense, the only time that this issue was very much on the table was when the European Parliament actually sort of forced Joseph Borrell to come and speak at the European Parliament, where other members of the European Parliament were discussing this issue. So in a way, it was very convenient for Borrell to come and speak there because he had to. He doesn't have a choice not to come to the European Parliament when he's being summoned. And when he was speaking, he hardly referred to the Israeli democratic overhaul. He was referring much more to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he was trying to on the stage tell to the foreign minister of Israel that we are not interfering in your business. We are discussing it, as the European Parliament is discussing many other issues. I think there are other micro, meso, and macro explanations to why is the EU not interfering. The micro could be, a new ambassador that is very much familiar with Israel and with the way of thinking in Israel and the new stuff that the EU embassy delegation in Israel have. They know that the criticism on Israel actually pushed them away. Nobody really listens, and the public opinion in Israel is turning against the EU. And we actually saw some improvement in the last few years in the public opinion in Israel about the EU, which is generally quite negative. So this is a micro level explanation. It doesn't really explain, I think, the situation. The meso explanation would be, the mid-level would be that after a long decade of really bad political relations that has deteriorated over the years under Netanyahu, the different governments of Netanyahu, the last year and a half under Lapid as foreign minister and then prime minister was a substantial improvement. And then we could see the Association Council being convened. After a decade, it wasn't convened, and it could stimulate and enhance the relations. There are negotiations over partnership priority, the agenda for the next 3 to 4 years between the sides. And the EU says, we don't want to ruin again and to mess the relations. So this is a meso level explanation. The macro level explanation would be, the global changes that have occurred in Europe and around the world when Russia was attacking Ukraine, and how valuable Israel is to the European Union in the sense of gas that is providing through Egypt. It's not a big quantity, but it's still quite as considerable one to the European, to the energy prices, maybe to lower prices when it comes to the increase of the inflation and increase in prices. It also helps Egypt maintain its stability because it helps them there financially. Israel is valuable in terms of intelligence when now Iranian weapon is being used by Russia in Ukraine, and it's really on the borders of the EU. The security intelligence of Israel is extremely important. And also security, all the industrial, the defense industry in Israel. So all those countries are looking where to buy their weapons. Germany is now closing the Aero 3 agreement, and such considerations are at the macro level. Another macro level explanation would be the Abraham Accords. That was, as we said, the only game in town at the neighborhood. And the EU was late to join that sort of party. I'm not sure if it's now a crashed party. It's not yet there. But the EU was not there because it was under Trump, and the EU was kind of reluctant because it sort of ignored the Palestinians. But now it wants a part at the Abraham Accords, at the Negev Forum, and Israel is considering how to involve them. I think there was also talk when Netanyahu was there in Germany, how to involve Germany in economic projects, so maybe less the EU, but the EU do want a stance. And Joseph Borrell has actually visited Saudi Arabia. So to relate to what Eli was saying, Joseph Borrell was actually trying to get the Arab Peace Initiative together with what the EU has been offering to Israel in 2013, the special privilege partnership. Obviously, this is not an initiative for this government, but this is something that Borrell is working on. So I think in his mind, the Middle East peace process is still the major concern, much more than the democratic issue in Israel. So in that terms, I think the EU, if to answer also the issues of the trends in EU-Israeli relation, Joseph Borrell and the EU, the European External Action Service and the Commission are actually valuing the relations with Israel and don't want to hamper them. So those are part of the explanations for the silence from Brussels.
Thank you. Barak, I'm going back to you because Maya mentioned the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And we recently saw two regional security summits being convened, first in Aqaba, then in Sharm. Quite surprisingly, like the most right-wing government is all of a sudden coordinating, engaging with the Palestinian regional diplomacy. This is in the middle of Ramadan, the overlap with Passover coming up next week, a lot of sensitivities on the Israeli-Palestinian interface. How do you explain the convenings of these summits, and what do you think they achieved, and how significant this modality of Israeli-Palestinian de-escalation attempts is?
Well, on the one hand, it is quite extraordinary that those two meetings in Aqaba and Sharm el-Sheikh have taken place. I must say that I was very surprised because the US tried to convene such a meeting during the previous government. The previous government, especially mostly under Bennett, refused to agree to, refused to this kind of format, and also saw it as a political, some sort of a political engagement with the PA, something which Bennett was against. Netanyahu, what he did is that he just dealt with this issue without telling anybody in his government. And therefore, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and many others found out about the meeting in Aqaba only a day before and they heard it in the press. And they, regarding the Israeli position in Aqaba, they heard it also after the meeting, also in the press. And I think this is why I must say that I'm having, on the one hand, it is important. I'm not saying it's good to have engagement with the Palestinians in such format. The problem is that I don't feel that there's real commitment by the Israeli government or by the Palestinians, I must say. I think it's mostly serves those meetings mostly serve a Palestinian request to at least try and show the Palestinian public that there's some sort of a process. There are nobody really thinks that anything can come out of it other than this alleged process. For Israel, it's good because it can say to the US, look what we're doing, and it's not that such a crazy government as you thought. And for the US and Egypt and Jordan, it also shows that, you see, we can relaunch some kind of a process between Israel and the Palestinians. The problem is that there's also a reality. And in both the Aqaba summit and the Sharm summit, there were terror attacks by Palestinians on the day of the summit. And the pogrom in Hawara also happened on the day of the summit in Aqaba, shortly after the terror attack. And I think that when you look at that, when you look at the fact that after the same day of the meeting in Sharm, The Minister of Finance, Smotrich, gave a speech in Paris saying that there's no such thing as a Palestinian people, that it's an invented people, and gave a speech alongside the map of Greater Israel. And as I think, at the end of the day, it seems to me that this process is disconnected from reality. It's nice for diplomats and journalists, the few journalists that are still interested in this issue, but we have to be honest that the reality is just totally different than those meetings, and I just feel that soon enough there's not going to be. I don't see a continuation of that process after Ramadan.
Thank you, Ariel. Nachman, you were Minister of Diaspora Affairs, and currently what we're seeing is more and more Jewish organizations and individuals, including ones that were never critical of Israeli policies in the past, are gradually speaking up, criticizing steps being conducted by the government. We see that also regarding visits by Netanyahu and his ministers abroad, when there are demonstrations and petitions and statements by Jewish leaders against the government. What do you make of that? How much should Israel be concerned of changes in attitudes within Jewish communities abroad, and how much should it take into account the diaspora position when making its policies?
Well, you asked a few questions, not only one. I start with the last one. In my view, and I've been saying that time and again in every opportunity during the cabinet meetings and every other opportunity, the government of Israel should take into consideration, I would say even formally and officially, where and what the Jewish communities in the diaspora stand. And because every decision made by the state of Israel in general, in particular by the cabinet, impact the life of Jews out of the country. And the current crisis between the United States and Israel is just one example. I can give you more of that. Unfortunately, they either don't, they paid, I think our cabinet, our government did pay attention, but again, not enough. The series of decisions made by the present government on what we call Jewish affairs and the present reform or judicial overall, they didn't notice that there are millions of Jews living out of the country, and what they have in common with Israel, one of the things they have in common with Israel is democratic values. And that's why the outcry is so loud. That's why Jews have raised their voice, something I haven't seen in the past, criticizing Israel publicly. Usually, if they want to say something, they come and whisper to us in our ears, maybe you should do this, maybe you should do that, but they never come out so openly in demonstration, in open letters, in petitions. And of course, they haven't done something that they did so many times in the past, convincing the administration, especially in the United States, where most of the Jews live, 6 million of them. They haven't done that. They haven't used their political power in the United States to convince the administration either to invite Netanyahu or to take a certain policy towards the current affairs in Israel. That's something which I haven't seen. Usually these are the Jews, the Jewish community in the United States is I would say the stable and the solid foundation of the Israeli-US relations. In this case, it works against the government. And one of the things I'm sure, and I've looked at a series of polls recently, Biden went so far. One of the reasons is that he knows, and probably his advisor tell him, that the Jewish community supports this position and will not object it. They will go with him. And and of course they take into consideration where the American Jewish community is, because they need them for whatever election is coming, presidential or whatever. So this is something new. I haven't seen that. And the government, which handled the judicial reform irresponsibly in Israel, the same applies to the Jewish community or the Jews in the diaspora. And I'm sure, unfortunately, that they will pay a price for that, because it will create or it will create or a certain crisis which has already been there 2 or 3 years ago between the Jewish diaspora and the government of Israel, and unfortunately the state of Israel, something that we cannot tolerate, I would say. Again, the government has a minister serving as a minister on diaspora affairs. I'm not sure that he will be welcomed if he travels now abroad, as it happened to inside the country. Government ministers are being heckled and interrupted wherever they go by people, and they don't want to even listen to them. That will happen to him, and if he travels now to the United States or elsewhere, as it happened to the prime minister. So that shows by itself that the crisis is here and significant. And the government should also, if they now reassess their policy where they are and what went wrong. So one of the fronts that they have to invest some efforts is what has happened and what will happen in the Israeli diaspora relationship.
Eli, this week, the last week of March, we're supposed to celebrate the Negev Forum Ministerial Summit convening in Morocco, which was postponed to an unknown date, given potential for Israeli-Palestinian escalation. We also see relationships slowing down with the UAE, with Jordan, maybe with other Arab countries. So it seems like the regional momentum is shifted, and what was a positive momentum over the last 2 or 3 years has shifted to the negative. What do you see happening in the Israel-Arab relation at the moment? How we can maintain, sustain the achievement that Israel had in its regional ties over the last few years, if we can do so at all at the official level. If not, maybe the focus should be on the unofficial level in the coming years.
Yeah, well, I think that the Arab states, they are watching very carefully what's going on in Israel. One is the judicial reform, and secondly, how the Palestinian issue is evolved. And the two are somehow connected. I'll say something about it in a minute. But generally, first of all, speaking about how the Arab world is reacting, so you could see that there are a group of states and organizations that are very much happy of what is going on in Israel. And it's a kind of a revival of an Arab notion that existed a long time before, which is waiting for Israel to wither away or collapse into itself. And of course, that this view, the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas, they share this kind of view. Now, when you talk about those countries that have relations with Israel, the situation is more complicated because on the one hand, they watching from a side and they do not involve themselves because, first of all, they are themselves not a democracy. So therefore, this is a domestic Israeli issue. But once that domestic Israeli issue is becoming also regional, when it gets to the Palestinian issue, then it is their concern as well. Moreover, one of the most important things that led some of the Arab states to have relations with Israel is, of course, sorry for the phone, is of course the issue of the connection to the United States. Now, if something so significant happened now to Israeli-American relations, that means that some of the Arab states may suspect that Israel is not that strong in Washington as it used to be. Israel is an important kind of bridge. That in the past we play a very important role in bridging between Egypt and the United States, Jordan and the United States, and to some extent also with the Gulf countries. And here now there is a big question to the ability of Israel to play that role. Jordan is a very specific case study because Jordan, as we know, the local society is very much against Israel and the peace treaty itself. And it's not for the first time that the parliament called to abolish or to evict the Israeli ambassador. That's a new thing. And this is something which is very much connected with the anti-normalization organizations. And to some extent, of course, it's connected with the fact that at least half of the society in Jordan is Palestinian. So this is very specific to Jordan. Egypt, for example, I mean, there are no Palestinians in Egyptian society. Nevertheless, even then, there are very much many of them belong to anti-normalization, and therefore we don't see many people-to-people activities. The situation was completely different with Morocco, Bahrain, and the Emirates until, let's say, a few months ago. I mean, very strong ties, not only on the governmental level, but also on the people-to-people level. They still continue to some extent. There is a certain halt, especially between Israel and Morocco. I do see that there is some continuation between Israel and the Emirates, especially those agreements that were signed some time ago and the signing of the free market between the two countries. So that will probably continue. The major thing from their point of view is the question of stability in the Middle East. And as long as there is stability, from their point of view, they might continue the normalization. But once you have a disruption or you have a major tension, especially, as I said before, with the Palestinians, then it will affect, it's already affecting, but what we see so far, in my mind, it's only the beginning. And here it a lot depends on the Israeli policy, on policy and statement, because the Israeli decision maker, they have to take into account, they are now, I mean, since the last, I don't know, 2 decades at least, and especially the Abraham Accord, they are part of the region, and they have to take into account the interest of those countries that we have peace treaty with them. And if they don't going to do it, then they might pay a very dear price for that neglect. So I very much hope that what happened in the last 2 or 3 weeks, you know, they gave them an indication of what might be the direction that Israel's relations in the Middle East are heading. And therefore, this is very regretful, and I very much hope that a very important, and I even would say significant change will happen in Israel's foreign policy in the region.
We heard, Maya, about Netanyahu wanting to visit Washington and not being invited. We know that Netanyahu wants to visit the UAE, and his visit has been canceled or postponed once again.
Exactly, that was, Nimrod, it was meant to be his major achievement of the Abraham Accord. I mean, the first visit in the UAE, and that was canceled. And instead, Naftali Bennett was invited, right? You know, so, you know, it's a good sign.
Yeah, the doors are opening for Netanyahu in Europe, of all places. London, Paris, Rome. Those are the countries that Netanyahu has visited in recent months. He heard criticism there. He met protesters over there in front of his hotels. What do you make of these visits and the messages that were voiced in them to the Israeli Prime Minister? And also, you know, during the protests here, we've been hearing a lot of comparisons to liberal countries in Europe, Hungary, Poland, processes that were happening there. Do you expect Netanyahu to once again step up relations with Orban and the like he did in previous terms?
Oh, first, I don't think Netanyahu needs to step up his relations with Orban. Nothing happened to them. There's no damage. So the relations with Hungary between Netanyahu and Likud people to Orban are ongoing in a good state as they were before. And we saw some visits already, but I'll refer to that maybe in a few minutes. So as you well described, there is a push factor and a pull factor when it comes to Netanyahu's traveling abroad, because the UAE does not allow him to come after Ben-Gvir went to to the Sharif al-Haram, and the United States is not inviting him. Regularly, the Israeli Prime Minister is invited within the first couple of months, and we are already 3 months. And as Biden said, there will be no invitation in the near future. So that's the push factor. And then I don't think Netanyahu can go to Beijing or to Moscow nowadays after the war of Russia against Ukraine. So, and I think they're on the other side, right, with Russia cooperating with Iran and buying weapons from them. So what is left? If you look, where Prime Minister can go, and he's looking for, significant destinations, then what is left is Berlin, Paris, and London, and he's been to those three destinations. So there is a common factor that is of interest to European countries, and I've mentioned that, and that is Iran and the weapons that Iran is selling to Russia. It's actually in the visit that Netanyahu has made to Paris first, then Berlin, and last London, we saw all three of them stating what the EU institutions have not stated, that they are concerned with the democratic backsliding, expected backsliding in Israel. And Netanyahu was trying to say there's no backsliding in democracy, and you saw that no one believes him. And the warnings were there. We share common values. It's important for us, for our cooperation, that you remain a democratic state, and they all stated that. And then the prices went up when Netanyahu went to London, and the demonstrations were so loud outside the Downing 10, and there were no photos taken, and no the speeches were cancelled. So the prices, our tag is going up, and sadly also we see, going back to what I answered before about Brussels not really interfering or stating its mind, that the EU and Israel shares common values, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and etc., and separation of powers. We hear that coming from other places, and suddenly Brussels, that what was always the bad cop, Brussels was always the one criticizing Israel, again on the Middle East peace process, the lack of the Middle East peace process. Now we see a switch of roles, because then the countries were able to hide behind Brussels, because it was the high representative that would criticize Israel and would get all the bashing from Israel afterwards. And the member states could keep good relations with Israel. But now it's the other way around. Now we see the leaders of those countries criticizing Israel, and Brussels is keeping silent. So I think Brussels have maybe learned a lesson here, and knows that if it will speak on this issue of democratic backsliding in Israel, then again, this momentum of incitement from the government towards the EU would be very, very strong. It has been going on for months and years before those members of coalition became the government, or ministers. Amichai Shikli is bashing the EU constantly when he can. So just, Brussels now doesn't give him the excuse to do so, and leaves this sort of position to member states. And with regards to Poland and Hungary, the relations between Israel and Poland has deteriorated already in 2018, and even more so in 2021, over internal legislation of Poland about returning properties of Jews and non-Jews. Most of them are Polish, from the days of World War II and the communist period. And then our ambassador was taken back to Jerusalem, and it took a long time to try and repair the relations. So we saw Poland actually voting against Israel when it came to the UN General Assembly, voting that would address the occupation of Israel to the International Criminal of Justice. So Poland is really switching against Israel, and Hungary is a good, still remains good relations. We saw all those visits of Yair Netanyahu and other people from the Likud party and the organizations linked to the Likud. So the relations are very strong. And just a few days ago, we heard from the foreign minister of Poland that they were actually asked by the Israeli government about their judicial reform. So it's very clear that our government is learning lessons. And actually the Polish lesson is really scary, maybe for Israelis, for the camp that is trying to resist this democratic overhaul. It's not even judicial overhaul. It's a democratic overhaul in Israel. It's a regime overhaul. And the Polish case shows us that when there were big demonstrations and the government took a step back, but then the government prepared the ground better and was able sometime later to pass this undemocratic legislation when it came to the court system. So we have a lot to learn from Poland, also from the, what not to do and what the government is trying to learn what to do and how to pass this legislation. But relations with Poland are not good still.
And that's a point that keeps on coming up when we speak with people from Turkey, Hungary, Poland, about us having the advantage of seeing what processes they went through when they didn't know where it goes. I think both sides in Israel are learning lessons from those countries and trying to utilize them.
It's very
we have
much
now time
spoken.
for a short round,
Yeah.
which you can kind of relate to things said by others before we take a couple of questions from the audience, whether on topics that others said or whether you want to comment on something. Barak, would you like to add something maybe about Negev Forum, Israel-Arab relations?
Yeah, definitely. I think that one of the phenomena that we saw in the last 3 months was the super fast deterioration of the Abraham Accords, which I want to remind you were Prime Minister Netanyahu's main foreign policy legacy in all of his political career. And Netanyahu came into office thinking that he will continue the Abraham Accords and go to Abu Dhabi and all those things. But again, reality stepped in. And it was pretty clear. It was also clear to those countries that, when Abdullah Ben Zayed, the foreign minister of the UAE, was here several weeks before the elections and met all the heads of parties, he told Netanyahu, listen, I'm concerned that you'll form a government with those extremists. And Netanyahu did it. And the result was exactly as Abdullah Ben Zayed warned him, a cooling down of the relations between Israel and the UAE. And I think when you look overall, you see it in every country in the region. Netanyahu spoke about Saudi Arabia. Since this government was formed, I counted at least 7 statements by Saudi Arabia against Israel with escalating rhetoric and language, including in recent weeks, the Saudis started using again the term the occupation government when they refer to Israel. This is something that they stopped doing for a long time. You see in Morocco that the Negev Forum ministerial meeting was postponed and did not take place. You see that there's no new date for such a meeting. You see that many other Negev Forum activities are postponed or canceled. You see that there are no visits, no ministerial visits. And even just the other day, when Israel and the UAE signed the customs agreement, it was signed on the one hand by the foreign minister, Eli Cohen, on the other hand by the Emirati ambassador. I think that, this shows you something. This imbalance in protocol also is proof to a problem in the relations. Mohammed Ben Zayed, the president of the UAE, sent his closest confidant Khaldun al-Mubarak to Israel last week to convey a very harsh message about the relationship and where it can go. And I think you can see it everywhere, really everywhere. And I don't know where this is gonna end. I'm very concerned that if this trend is going to continue, then very soon we'll have our ambassadors from those countries back in Israel. And it will become more like our relationship with Jordan and Egypt than what we hoped would be our new relationships with Bahrain, Morocco, and the UAE. At the moment, the trend is very, very negative, very, very bad. And I see no reason to think that it's going to get any better.
Thank you. Nachman, would you like to relate to one of the issues raised? You're on mute. You're on mute, Nachman.
Sorry. As I said before, I'm trying to figure out what is the foreign policy of this government, and I don't see too much. I'm almost personally disappointed that they are not investing on the Middle East, and especially following the Abraham Accords, because this was great opening and it could invite more and more partnerships and cooperation between us and them. And it seems like they are even destroying this very promising beginning, which is very, very disappointing. But and don't tell me that they don't know when they let Minister Ben Gvir go on the mountain, or other statement made by coalition members and government ministers. They know very well that they harm the relations with the Arab world, and they don't care. And of course, the Hawara pogrom, as Barak rightly mentioned, was a terrible, terrible event, a tragedy, if you ask me, because it disrupted our relationship with the United States, with the Jewish community, with the world as a whole, those who are following the Middle East, and especially our relations with the Arab world. And Israel hasn't done too much since then to make sure that not only that it will not reoccur, that the world will know and understand that it was not our policy, it was not a governmental policy, and by closing our eyes and arresting, I think so far only 2 Israelis were arrested, that means that we are not doing enough to make sure that our neighbors know that destroying or Arab villages and Arab communities is not official policy of the State of Israel.
Thank you. Eli?
I think in continuation of what Barak have said, I will add that, and Barak knows it very well, of course, that we have always to remember the difference or the gap between the public and the hidden. And but still, when we see the continuation of a secret relation between the countries, we do have to remember that what is being said in public is very important. And if we go backwards, we see that the first change of the behavior of certain Arab countries towards Israel, especially in the Gulf, was the change of the discourse, whether it was the Saudi, whether it was the Bahraini, and other countries as well. So, and it followed later by concrete steps that were taken. And at the same time, during all that period, certain secret deals were made. So what we're witnessing now, the change in the rhetoric, in the discourse, therefore, is very important, because that signifies to us that they are seeing something which they very much against, and it's a kind of a flag that they are waving, you know. It's a warning wave, you know, saying that, listen, it might get worse, it might deteriorate, and I think that what we are witnessing right now, those negative or these statements, you know, against Israel that we saw by the Saudis and by the Emiratis, especially with regard to Smotrich's statements, with regard to the fact that there is no Palestinian people and so on. So they deserved an immediate response, and it came from all of the countries. Now, in case the tension will increase, and in case Israel will take further steps, especially in the occupied territories, then no doubt those countries will have to respond, because first of all, they will need to react to their public opinion. And secondly, maybe it would not be in their interest, you know, to continue those relations. And by the way, we have a good example. The second Intifada in 2000, it led to the cutting off relations with Morocco, with Tunisia, with Oman, with Qatar. Qatar, well, they continued later, but anyway, that was a significant event that dramatically affected Israeli-Arab relations. To what extent it can be repeated, this government has to take into account that it is very much a possibility. And I think that now those countries, and I said it in the past, the good thing from maybe their point of view is that they have a certain leverage. They have certain leverage because now, I mean, whatever they will do, not only say, will affect our place in the Middle East. And therefore, we need to take it into account, because in the past, we could do whatever we want almost without taking notice of what they say, because they are always against us and so on. But today, this is a completely different situation, and we are on a verge of worsening our relations with those countries. And I think that the Emirates and Morocco and Bahrain, they are in particular are standing on the fence now, looking at Israel to see what will happen next. Some of the things that we do see continued, it's a product of things that happened in the past, like signing agreements, for example, which were planned a long time ago, and maybe they are now being signed. This is, by the way, what happened with Israel and the Emirates. But at the same time, you see other statements and behavior. So all this, as I said before, it's a red light to Israel, or let's say it's a yellow light. Okay, a red, it's too early. It's a yellow light before they continue with the radical policy in the Middle East.
Yeah. Thank you, Eli. And you're right that most of the cooperation does continue with the Arab world, with other things were agreed in the past. All these unilateral arrangements like the I2U2 or the trilaterals with Jordan and the UAE, or with Morocco and the EU, or with Egypt and the EU, those are the things continuing, not a lot of new stuff happening, and not a lot of continuation on the bilateral level. Maya, would you like to add something?
Yeah, several points. I think first we see I don't know if it's ignorance or a very, to my opinion, distorted thinking about foreign policy by many members of the government. And also you see in Israel, I think it's quite clear to the democratic liberal camp how important and vital the US relations are, and other relations with other countries, such as the Abraham agreements and others. Europe, of course, those are major strategic friends. So the United States and Europe, be it economically and otherwise. And this government holds really strange positions in which ministers go against. Why do we need them? Keep silent and don't interfere in our internal affairs. So this also lack of understanding of the relations between Israel as a democratic country and its foreign relations, and the quality of its foreign relations is lacking. And I think this comes back to a biblical sentence of nations that dwells alone. And this Am Levadad Yishkon is something that Israelis have, I think, lived according to for many, many years, because we're secluded in our region. And I think this thinking is sort of playing today. To some extent, we see the friends, the one who are speaking and criticizing the plan of Netanyahu, the regime overhaul, is actually our best friends. So if the EU keeps silent, I wonder what that says. I think in what Netanyahu is actually doing, he is doing a huge U-turn. If things continue as they are right now, this is a huge U-turn from all what was considered to be his achievements in foreign policy, but also in economy, and of course his support for the independence of the Supreme Court. And also when we speak about the BDS movement and such, anti-Israeli movements, what this government is doing is extremely, I think, hurtful to Israel in those senses. There was talk in the European Parliament about sanctions on Israel, and Joseph Borrell was stating very clearly, we will not cancel the association agreement because it is not an agreement with the government, it's an agreement with the country. But yet, those are really disturbing calls that we are hearing. And obviously, the sanctions can come if the internal domestic situation with this right-wing extreme government also plays a role with the Palestinians. We have seen some indications of the direction that this is going, but let us remember that in the coalition agreements, they are actually speaking about be it annexation or be it that the right of the Jewish people is all over the land. So this is very disturbing.
Thank you, Maya. We have a few questions from the audience. Nachman, I'll get back to you in a second when we have a chance to reply. I'll list the topics. You can relate to those you want and leave the others for others. We have a question on Israel's relation with China. Where is it at the moment? We have a question about the opening of the Azeri embassy in Israel and how internal developments within Israel are shaping that relationship between Israel and Azerbaijan. We have a question on the future of the Negev Forum. What do you assess will happen next? And about Israel's global standing and what is realistic to hope for in terms of possible accomplishment in Israel's foreign policy. So those are the topics. Nachman, if you want to add anything beyond that, feel free. Let's do a final round. Barak, starting with you.
No, I just wanted to add to what was discussed before. Another point that we haven't mentioned is international institutes or organizations like the Criminal Court of Justice in The Hague and others. Israel was enjoying for years I would say the Iron Dome, not only of the United States, but of other democratic states. And if we somehow withdrew ourselves from the small and exclusive club of democratic states, we would lose this Iron Dome too. And recently, by issuing this arrest order to Putin, I think that also serves as a very popular term now, a yellow card to Israel too, that the Criminal Court of Justice may go one step forward also towards Israel. And we again, since we are so much focused and dealing with our own business here, ignoring the world in general positions or opinions, and doing what this government believes in, this coalition believes in, when we wake up sometime sooner or later, we'll find ourselves isolated in many aspects. And one of them will be the freedom of or the liberty of international organization, again, specifically this one, but even others, to pass some resolutions and to arm Israel internationally. And that also will serve the BDS, whatever it is, but also in general, Israel's position in the world. So just figure out that while that something is going on around, it's not all of us, as Maya said, the Am Levadad Ishkon, it's fine, but we are not Am Levadad Ishkon. We are Am Shochen that lives surrounded by many other states, countries, and the entire world. And that's how we have to look at the situation.
Thank you. And you already responded to the question about the global standing. Barak, over to you.
Yeah. So I'll refer to two questions. First, about China. I think it's what's interesting is, again, if this government had time to deal with serious issues and not only with tarnishing our democracy. Prime Minister Netanyahu, during the transition, before he was sworn in, he gave an interview to Barry Weiss on her podcast, and he said something very interesting about China. He said that for many years, when he was prime minister, he opened up Israel to China and put a lot of emphasis in the relations because China is a huge market and it was good for Israeli companies. But he said that he realized, it took him time, but he realized that there are national security implications. And I think that's the first time that Netanyahu acknowledged that relationship with China today are about national security and not only about economic relations. And at least what he hinted is that he's going to do some sort of a policy shift on China, although the previous government made quite a dramatic quiet but dramatic policy shift on China. But again, he didn't do anything because he's not dealing with anything serious other than the judicial reform. About the embassy of Azerbaijan, I think it was long due. Israel has an embassy in Azerbaijan for many years. It's great that Azerbaijan decided to open an embassy here, but I think that it needs to be looked at in the context of Nagorno-Karabakh, and Israeli military assistance to Azerbaijan. The Azeri army is using a lot of Israeli weapon systems. Some of those weapon systems were a game changer in the previous round of fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia. Israel is also importing oil from Azerbaijan. It's a strategic relationship. Obviously, the Iranian issue is also relevant here, and I think that it's good that Azerbaijan opened the embassy. By the way, this is the work of the previous government. I think the push for this move came when Benny Gantz, the former Minister of Defense, was in Baku and met with President Aliyev and with other senior officials. I don't think we know the full picture of what happened in this visit that led to the opening of the embassy. I can just assume that it had to do with some sort of a very big arms deal.
Eli? You're on mute. We cannot hear you, Eli.
Yeah, first of all, about Am Levadad Yishkon, people dwelling alone, the famous phrase. Well, actually, I think that what I was trying to show in my book, and that is quite a surprise also for me, I must admit, that Israel has never dwelt alone in the Middle East in many ways, because it did have secret relations with minorities and states in the Middle East. And therefore, on many occasions, it wasn't alone. But I mean, the threat or the risk of being alone is very much there, and therefore we have to take it into account, and especially during these times. Something about Azeri relations, I do believe that this is one of the interesting relationships that we know very little about them. Most of it is being held probably secretly. And the main thing that the Azeri gets from Israel is, of course, the arms and ammunition. When we are talking about few billions of dollars every year, which is a lot. And in return, Israel gets probably intelligence. It sits in Azerbaijan, which is very much close to the Iranian border. And you know, in many ways, it's like Iran sits in Lebanon through the Hezbollah, and it sits in Syria, actually on our border. And Israel, likewise, having a base or whatever, I mean, so-called, in Azerbaijan. And since the Abraham Accords, obviously, with the Emirates and with Bahrain, which are very close to Iran. And you know what will happen maybe one day. Still, I mean, it's unknown, because as we have mentioned before, the Emirates, not Bahrain, but the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, they have resumed diplomatic relations with Iran. But so that's a strategic target or element in Israel's foreign policy, and for quite a few years. And finally, something about China, which we are not discussing that much, and I think it's important, because slowly, the Chinese are entering the Middle East, and they are becoming an important force. And I think that how they mediated, quite surprisingly, I must admit, the reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia was very important. Obviously, the Chinese have a stake here because they are very much dependent on oil in general coming from the Middle East. But nevertheless, it goes hand in hand with their target in any way to improve their standing and place in the region. They are doing that for many years in Africa already, we know that. So I do believe that if you take into account what they are doing, also in Israel, by the way, Port of Haifa, and other business and construction firms and so on, and you see their involvement in other countries, this is something that we have to watch very carefully. And it is true that Israel has relations with China, like it has relations with Russia, but at the same time, it's not on the same level as with the United States. So therefore, the entrance of China into the Middle East in a meaningful way obviously affects Middle East relations or the balance of power and so on. And this is something that we have to take into account and watch very carefully.
Thank you. Maya?
Very briefly, I think a lot of people said, so with regards to Am Levadat Ishkon, a nation that dwells, or people that dwells alone, Eli, you're completely right, and it's a fascinating picture, but the people of Israel did not know about, and the business obviously did not operate, so that now the new layer...
Maya, I agree, yes. This
I'm not in contradiction, I'm adding.
This is the perception, yes.
Yes. So when you look at this government, this inexperienced government that doesn't take this wealth of knowledge because they don't have previous experience in government, and you look at the people of Israel, then this is what I was referring to. And now we have another layer, as you were saying, of business to business and people to people that are under threat. And I would like to refer also to another. We say also in Israel, or lagoim, a light onto the nation. So this is something that Israel was trying to, to be a light to other nations. We are definitely not a light to any nation those days. We had a chance to be, if the government, if the previous government and those opportunities that were opening, maybe with Saudi Arabia and other countries, and the improvement of relations with the European Union would have continued, we could have, transformed our foreign relations in a significant way. Maybe also, now it looks as an imaginary scenario, but to really take the Arab initiative with the EU incentives and maybe solve the Middle East peace process with the Palestinians. And nowadays we look completely the opposite. I hope we'll go back to being light to the nations very soon.
Sometimes the 100 days mark is a cliche, it's a popular cliche, but I think in our case, we see that dramatic things have been happening in the first 3 months of this new government, and a significant change in foreign policy, not only in the content, but the whole overall picture of it, moving from positive momentum and proactive diplomacy to damage control, reactiveness to responses by others. Yet I think many of the actors that you mentioned are still in a wait-and-see mode, whether there will be escalation with the Palestinians during Ramadan, whether the overhaul will be completed. I think things could deteriorate more than what we described here, but maybe even the protest or the pro-democracy movement in Israel that already had some achievements can also rescue some of Israel's foreign policy by stepping up its activism on the streets. Thank you very much, Barak, Nachman, Eli, Maya, for being here with us, for sharing your extensive experience and insight with us, and we look forward to continuing this conversation later on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nimrod.
Chag Sameach to everyone. Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.